So good to see everybody this morning. We're glad you're well enough to be out. I know this is the season when people start kind of getting sick, but I think we're doing fairly well, and maybe at least just yet, maybe the flu hadn't invaded in a big way, but we've still got lots of folks that are sick at this or that. But great to see everybody here today. Hope you're doing well. In the book of Hebrews, we have a series of admonitions, exhortations, if you will, all of them designed to lift our faith and to strengthen us in the Lord. We're going to look at in a moment that he's dealing with some specific problems. I call this lesson Ancient Admonitions, or Exhortations rather. Ancient exhortations with modern applications. We realize that the Bible is an unchanging book, and the message is unchanging. And the application, the need of it is unchanging. It is still important to us today. Sometimes we turn it a deaf ear because we're not so keyed in to being admonished spiritually, and yet it's so very important to know. Ancient exhortations with modern applications. At the end of the book of Hebrews, he sort of explains at the verse 22 that he urges us all to bear with his word of exhortation. That's why we kind of look at the book of Hebrews as one long exhortation. He calls it brief, and yet in some ways it's just about as long as any of the epistles, but it's a brief exhortation. And the word exhortation, it sort of carries with it the idea of coming alongside and admonishing and strengthening and saying things to help, saying things to lift another up, and those are some of the ideas behind it. It's kind of a word that has different means of interpretation because it basically has a personal element to it. It suggests the idea, like I said, of coming up to you on a personal level, and yet that's not the only means that's not the only way it could be looked at. Because this whole epistle is a word of exhortation. It's actually written, and it's, more like a sermon, if you will. And when you stop and think about it, nobody came alongside personally to somebody else as this was delivered. And yet there is some very personal words in it, very personal words of exhortation. And it doesn't matter, as you're going to see in this lesson, it doesn't matter that it's close to 2,000 years old. Sort of hard to believe, isn't it? This epistle was written probably a little later in that century, so it wouldn't be quite 2,000 years, but it's getting awful close. One of these days, some who are living here, maybe not me, will be alive to see the church having been 2,000 years old, and everything that we read in the book of Acts and in the New Testament will now be 2,000 years since that happened. So it's pretty amazing when you stop and think about all that. Okay, this epistle might be nearly 2,000 years old, and yet here we are at the end of 2018, fixing to be 2019, and this epistle has so much to say to all of us. And I'll show you how that's so, because when you look at, I'm just going to take a few phrases, you'll see it encompasses from chapter 2 all the way throughout the epistle, but look at some of the things that we read. And you think about this, and you think about the spiritual conditions that we face in our time and other times. Look at these words. I'm not going to dwell a lot on each one, but people drifting away from the faith. People neglecting what's so important. People who just finally fall away because they've lost their faith. They're no longer strong like they used to be. People who grow hardened and put up a wall against the truth. People have grown dull of hearing, and maybe we don't listen like we once did. We don't we don't apply the message. Growing sluggish, a little lazy, a little not moving as fast in the faith and growth as we ought to. Wavering. The idea that we're not on a steadfast course anymore. We're kind of not applying ourselves like we once did. Forsaking. forsaking important things like the assembly, shrinking back, drawing back, like as I understood it from the original language, it was the very idea of something shrinking like you washed it and it drew up. Everybody's kind of had that experience. You bought a new garment, you washed it, it shrank. And it draws back. And yet, in this case, he's talking about spiritually. We've drawn back from where we once were. Entangled in sinful things, entangled in fleshly things. And last of all, getting weary and just losing heart. And I'll be real honest with you, of all of those on the list, I'm not sure but what that last one is not only the killer, but it's also kind of one of those things that affects just about everybody. I mean, we get a little tired. We get a little tired of going on. But the losing of heart, losing of our, conviction, losing of putting ourselves into it. I say that it's just, we lose our motivations, don't we? We lose what drives us on to be Christians and to be faithful. So we have a series of things, and I can't cover them all, and I won't try to have a second lesson on this, but I'll just present a few of them that I thought were really, really important. You will see these in the Scripture in the book of Hebrews. And where it kind of throws us off is, a lot of the book of Hebrews is making the argument about the old law is being done away with and Christ's new covenant is coming into effect. And a whole lot of people kind of envision that the book of Hebrews is all about that. And because we never had the problem of being under the old law, we sort of dismiss Hebrews sometimes. But that's not all that the book of Hebrews is about. It's really, if you want to know the truth, it's about second-generation Christians that aren't being as strong as they ought to be. And boy, that sure draws a lot of us into the picture, because a lot of us are second, maybe even third-generation Christians. And we've done this, I have, all my life. I've been going to church. There was not a day that I didn't regularly go to church in my life, because it was my life. It was the life of my parents. And therefore, I know nothing but this, and yet we all know the danger of any second generation anything, and that is you lose part of the zeal. You lose what this is all about, why it's so important. And so, where all these exhortations stand out, when he's admonishing, almost always in the book of Hebrews, he goes along arguing something and making a point, and some great points, and some very practical points. But then he'll come along and say, therefore. On the basis, therefore always means, okay, well, now I've been arguing all this. Now here's kind of the conclusion. Here's what we ought to do about that. So therefore, and then he follows it by saying, let us. Therefore, let us do this. And that's the exhortation. That's the admonition. That's the effort to kind of call us to the side and say, okay, we've been talking about this point, but this is more than an argument about the law. This is more than just some technical, reading of what's really important here, the differences between old and new and all of that. But there's such practical thinking in all of this. Therefore, here's what we need to do about this. And it's almost, to me, it hits me like in a time when people are all those things that we just got through reading, that list of phrases I gave you, and they're facing that in the church, that it becomes a priority. Here's a plan. Here's what we need to do. Here's what's going to help that situation. Therefore, here is what must take place. Let us do this. And the way he says that, it's without being real hypercritical, he's just basically said, here's something we all need to think about. Here's a plan that we all need to go with. And by saying us, it describes more than just one person or two people. It's sort of the idea all of us are there and we know it and we need to do better. So therefore, let us. So like I say, there's more than I'm going to give you this morning. But here's the first thing I believe he says about that. He says, let's sharpen our focus. Let's pay a little closer attention. Let's set our minds a little closer on this. I think, if you think about, we saw the word wavering in there, and wavering just kind of, that and drifting suggests the idea that the vehicle we're in, we're not really going very straight. We're kind of weaving on the road, and we're not keeping a straight path, and maybe we're moving dangerously close off the road, and we're wavering, we're drifting off course. And what do you have to do when you're there? If you're in your car and you're wavering, you're drifting off course, what do you have to do? You have to refocus. You have to set your attention back on the proper way. You have to pull your eyes back on where you're headed and make the course correction. Just that simple. Yeah, it's harder than that in reality spiritually, but it is just that simple as far as the answer. So he says in chapter 2, verse 1, therefore we must pay closer attention to what we have heard so that we don't drift, so that we don't drift off path. It requires refocusing. It requires getting our eyes back on the road. It requires getting our mind back in the game, if you want to put it that way. This text admonishes that what God has to say, His message, His teaching, this book, the New Testament, that it is of vital importance. It is such a serious message. It's so serious that he says, how will you escape if this gets neglected? How will you escape if you neglect what this book offers you by way of salvation? And that's how he follows the statement up here in chapter 2, verse 1. In verse 3, how will we escape? And he illustrates that historically by saying, the people that quit listening to Moses are the people that didn't make it to the promised land. The people that fell away throughout the centuries of the history of Israel were the people that quit listening to God and started listening to the world and started neglecting the most important message on the face of this earth, and they lost their relationship with God. What's going to happen? Why would we think, in all of the Bible, why would we think that you and I are any different from this? If that's historically always been the problem, that we drift, we waver, we get off course, if that's been the problem, then it's going to be our problem too. That's what I'm saying. That may be ancient, and what's interesting is, I said the Hebrews maybe 2,000 years ago, getting close to it, but what he talks about is nearly 2,000 years before him. He's talking about things that happened long before the Hebrew epistle was written, and yet what he's saying in essence is it's so very true. Because God knows man, and He knows what our problems are, and He knows one of our problems are we have a tendency to drift off course. And therefore the answer to drifting off course, whether it's physically or spiritually, is to sharpen your focus. And then the next thing he says in chapter 4 is, therefore, there's a promise that remains. Now, this is a whole line of argumentation in the book of Hebrews, and it's almost a little complicated if you want to know the truth. But he says, what he's saying is, we're not home yet. And again, what is he talking about? He's talking about the children of Israel. And he says, when did they get messed up? They weren't in the promised land yet. They got messed up before they got there. And he said, did those people that left Egypt, did they get to the promised land? And his whole point is, no. Many of them didn't. I'm not saying that to discourage you, nor was he for that matter. It's just that a promise still remains of entering His rest. And what that means for you and me is that we're not to heaven yet. We're not to our eternal home yet. And I have great hopes that all of us will be there and will have that reward. And in many ways, I believe that we will. But He's just told us we've got to keep focus. Now He says, let us fear. Let us fear. Since the promise isn't ours just yet, since the promise remains of entering His rest, let us fear that we might come short of that. And contrary to the message of many, it just comes right down to that. We have to have some concern in our hearts of not making it to heaven. it probably, in my mind, would be the absolute, to put it the phrase this way, sum of all fears. I can't think of anything I'm more afraid of than that. And still, sometimes, I can make a bad choice. It doesn't eliminate all of that, but the simple fact is that that's the greatest threat to anybody's life. Again, he had just said, how are we going to escape if we neglect this? So, if I go before God, one thing's for sure, I may, and you will be too, a person who's made some mistakes in life, but there's a difference between having, hit a few speed bumps along the way and having quit. And I don't want to neglect this message. And I don't want, to find out that I'm not going to escape damnation. How shall we escape, though, if we neglect it? And he's telling about the children of Israel leaving their captivity, but floundering and not making it to their place of rest. We don't want to come short of this. I know you don't. I know I don't. Just fight to keep it. Don't let the world get in your way. Don't let weariness get in your way. We're going to see in one of the last points, he's comparing all this like to a race that we have to stay in and stay with to make it to the end. So another thing he says, and all of these have a connection, let us pay good attention, let us be diligent, let us remain on course and all of that and keep our focus. Now he says, let us be diligent. And so, again, this is just a thought in line with all these other thoughts. And he said, let's be diligent to enter that rest. If there's a chance that I might not make it to heaven, then let me show more diligence so that nobody will fail. Through following all of those examples we see in the Bible, like the ancient people of God who ended up disobeying God, let's don't be them. One of the things that I love about God's Word, one of the things that's so helpful, which, by the way, they didn't exactly have. I'm talking about the children of Israel. I have their story. See, I get to benefit from what happened to them. That's not good news for them, but it's great news for me. I can see what happens to people on a journey. And I can find out sometimes it doesn't work out when we don't apply ourselves. So, God kind of gave you and I a special blessing in that we have a perspective they didn't get to have. We get to see how this thing works out when you grow disobedient and neglectful to Almighty God, when you don't show the diligence that you ought to show before God. So I want to add in a fear, and I want to add in a diligence, and I want to make sure that I don't come short of this great goal. So, in a little bit more positive light, he basically says, you grab hold of this and you don't let go. Let us, chapter 4, verse 14, because we have so much more than anybody before us ever had. We've got Jesus Christ, a high priest, who's highly sympathetic to us, and He's already passed through into the heavens. I'll tell you something else that, as far as I know anything about, those Old Testament people of God never had. They didn't have Jesus at God's right hand pleading for them. I do. I have the Lord Jesus at the right hand of God as my high priest, my sympathetic high priest, by the way. And he says, since we have that great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, you better hold on to that one and not give up. Don't surrender yourself over. He is called the high priest of our confession. And in Hebrews chapter 2, at verse 17, in all things he had to be made like his brethren, talking about Jesus, that he might become a faithful, a merciful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. So this has been done in our behalf. Hang on to it. let's remember, when he says, hold fast your confession, I may be wrong about the application, but, all of us kind of started our lives as Christians. We always, zero in on baptism. What did you do right before you were baptized? What did you say? You acknowledge that you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of living God. And as I understand it, all Christians made that confession. All people that were going to be baptized had to make that confession. Even really before they became Christians, this is what you did. That if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised Him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart a person believes, resulting in righteousness. But with the mouth you confess. That's just saying what's there in your heart, that you really believe that He is the Son of God, that God raised Him from the dead, and that you confess that you acknowledge that that is true, and that the word confession means that I agree with that. It's a term that says God is right about that, and I will acknowledge that in my heart in a positive way. Therefore, that Jesus is raised from the dead, that Jesus is your Lord, that Jesus has authority over my life, that I will face Him in the last day. All of that I am confessing. And he said, when you acknowledge that in the sight of God, not just that, that's all there is to it, that's not what I'm saying, but when you acknowledge that, that's going to result in salvation. Because you have acknowledged the greatest fact of all, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and that He is our great high priest, and that He is the Christ that was prophesied in the Old Testament. He is everything that God said He was going to be. So do not give up that relationship with Him. Do not give up what you have in Him. And I'll be real honest with you, if you go back and start in the book of Hebrews, it seems to me a whole lot of the argument is exactly about that. It's not just a dry, explanation of why we no longer follow the commands of the law of Moses. What it really is a defense. It's a defense that Jesus is now our solution. It's not the law, it's Jesus. It's not following all the precepts, the Sabbath days, the animal sacrifices and all of that. That's not it anymore. It's all about following Jesus. And if you begin in the first chapter of the book of Hebrews, the first thing he does is he said, you may think angels are really important, and I suppose they really are. They are higher than us. But they don't compare to Jesus. And then he goes on and says, you look to Moses. But he makes an interesting argument about Moses. He said he was a servant in God's house, and Jesus is the master over God's house. And all through, it's a comparison. You think those animal sacrifices were important? They were under the old covenant, but Jesus' blood is better than those. His covenant is a better covenant. His sacrifice is a better sacrifice. In every way, you and I have been blessed with something better, which, by the way, is a frequent theme of Hebrews. Something better that's been given to us. So let's hold fast the confession of our hope. Let stay with that point, but look over here a little bit later. That was early in the book, but in chapter 10, he said, we have a great high priest. We have a great priest over the house of God. Now look. Let us hold the confession of our hope without wavering, for He, God the Lord, who promised this, is so very faithful. Let us hold fast. God will not give up His promises. But you're going to have to do something. You're going to have to hold on to them. And you're going to have to stay with this and keep it. Don't give up, therefore. Don't surrender. The Lord has promised eternal life if you'll just be faithful to Him. So don't give up. Hold on. And then, I believe this is the last one, and that it was that we have to view the Christian life as like running a race. And therefore, let us run the race. Paul used that terminology. And so we're looking here in Hebrews chapter 4 at verse 11. That's not right. It's chapter 12. I didn't change the verse there. Hebrews chapter 12, very beginning. So, if you read him right there, and it's not verse 11, be the beginning, he said, now, and I want you to picture it like he's picturing it. He says, we have this great cloud of witnesses. And why did he say that? Well, he just got through with chapter 11. And in chapter 11, he's named off a whole bunch of people who by faith served God faithfully. And it just goes on and on and on. All the things that are said about that by faith. And we start, as early as Abel, for instance. And we go all the way down through guys like Noah and certainly Moses and Abraham and all the greats. And so here we are running our race. And here's how I picture it, because that's just how I am. And I'm running. By the way, this has never happened to me. I can't remember this time. But anyway, I'm running, and the crowds are cheering. That's what's never happened. Nobody ever cheered. That's why I didn't ever do good at that. Nobody cheered. Now I know. The crowds are cheering. Who's cheering? The cloud of witnesses. I'm running into the stadium, and they're going, wow, they're cheering me on. But I'm really tired of this. But they're up in their stands and they're saying, keep going, you're going to make it. Just stay with this. And they're all cheering. And who's cheering? Moses, Abraham, David. And you know what they're saying? It got real hard near the end. And I crossed the finish line. And you can too. And so here we're running, and there's this huge cloud of witnesses. I kind of think of it like being in a stadium, and you're looking up there, and there's just like, it looks like a cloud of people, because there's so many people up there in the stands, so many of God's people in this case. But he said, what they're saying also is, you throw off right now anything that encumbers you, anything that would trip you up, and then you endure in this race. Let us lay aside every encumbrance, every sin that might tangle us up, and let's run with endurance the race that's set before us. And to be real honest with you, understanding that the life of a Christian is sort of like a marathon race helps a lot, because I know this thing's not going to be over with unless I die, but it's not going to be over with today or tomorrow. I don't imagine I'll live to my mother's age, but if I do, I've got a lot to run yet. And even if I don't, even if it's 10 more years, it's quite a bit of time to run. And things can happen during those years. And maybe I grow weary, and maybe I get tired. But I can't quit. That's what he's saying. Don't let your heart get discouraged from running. And I think about the guys in marathon races, of which I never did that. But I would think it would get so easy to just give up. After a while, you're panting and you're tired, and your muscles are freezing up, and cramping up and everything. But in that situation, I would just think this. I would think, all I've got to do is put one foot in front of another until this is over. And there's some really great people of God. But, I'm serious about this. It just sort of got real hard before it was all over. And Abraham and Moses and different ones, it wasn't getting easier, it was getting harder, like a race. But he reassures you of something. He said, all you've got to do is look at that finish line, because it's more than a finish line. On the other side of that finish line is Jesus. And he already ran the race. And he finished it. And he's waiting for you. So just run your heart out until you can cross the line. And he said, do you think he had it hard? Did it get hard for Jesus before the end? Remember all that we talked about recently? Yes, it really got hard. It got the hardest it had ever been. But he crossed the finish line. And when he crossed the finish line, he didn't cross just some old spot in the road down there. He crossed into eternity and sat down at the right hand of God. And you and I won't do that, but we will reign with him, and we will sit with him, and we will have reward. There's reward at the end when you cross the line. Okay, I'm going to quit. I've been trying to, one of my recent secrets, I've got to not have so many slides. I've figured out that if you have 30 slides, you're not going to quit on time. So today I had 12. I'm still barely getting through. I don't know. Maybe did I used to talk a lot faster? I know I'm getting slower and everything, but it makes me wonder. Okay, thank y'all for your attention this morning. You won't have much time the next few days, but I wish sometime soon, go through the book of Hebrews, sit down with it in a quiet place, read it. You can read it a little bit, even though it's 13 chapters. And look for all of these times where he speaks up. You'll have to wade through all the arguments and then get to those spots where he said, okay, therefore, let's go do this. And you'll find great, great encouragement for the road ahead. We'll sing a song of encouragement. If you need to come, we welcome you, and we'd love to help you be baptized into Christ or to be restored to the Lord, whatever you need. While we're standing, you come if you have that need.